What makes watching a woman prepare dinner worthy of cinema? In most narrative films, an activity like this would probably be compressed into a few seconds or left completely outside the story. Chantal Ackerman does the opposite. In Jeanne Dielman 23 Quai du Commerce 1080 Bruxelles, she gives ordinary domestic activities an extraordinary amount of cinematic attention. Using Karen Hollinger's discussion of feminist film theory, I argue that this scene functions as a form of feminist counter cinema. Through its static framing, extended duration, and repetition, the scene challenges conventional representations of women by making domestic labor itself the subject of cinematic attention. Karen Hollinger explains that feminist film theory developed partly from the feminist movement of the 1960s and 1970s and became concerned with the ways cinema represents women and reproduces ideas about gender. Importantly, Hollinger describes feminist film theory as having a dual purpose. On one side, feminist critics analyze and criticize mainstream cinema's representation of women. On the other, feminist filmmakers and theorists advocate alternative forms of filmmaking that can challenge those representations. Hollinger calls this the relationship between critic and counter cinema. This distinction is particularly useful for Jeanne Dielman because Ackerman does not simply give us a different female character. She changes the way a woman's everyday life is represented through film form itself. Hollinger's discussion of the early images of women approach explains that feminist critics initially examined the ways mainstream Hollywood presented women through distorted or stereotypical images. But Hollinger then explains why later feminist theories moved beyond simply asking whether women were represented positively or negatively. The question became more complicated. How does cinema itself construct the meaning of women? This is where Ackerman's filmmaking becomes especially interesting. Jeanne is not simply a positive female character. The film does not need to tell us that she's strong, independent, or admirable. Instead, Ackerman changes what the camera considers important. She spends time on activities that conventional cinema would normally treat as insignificant. The veal cutlet preparation is therefore not just an example of a woman doing housework. It's an example of cinema being reorganized around an experience that has traditionally been marginalized. The central activity in this scene is domestic labor. Jeanne prepares food through a series of small practical actions. She handles the meat, prepares the ingredients, and works methodically through the process. Nothing conventionally dramatic happens. There is no major revelation. There is no confrontation. There is no romantic encounter. There is simply work, and that is exactly why the scene is significant. Domestic labor is necessary to everyday life, but it is often culturally treated as something natural that women simply do. The work becomes invisible precisely because it is repetitive and expected. Ackerman makes that invisibly visible. Instead of skipping over the preparation of the meal, she makes the viewer watch it. The film therefore asks us to reconsider what counts as cinematic action. If conventional cinema gives dramatic events several minutes of attention, why should preparing food be considered too insignificant to show? The most important formal technique here is duration. Ackerman does not simply tell us that Jian prepares dinner. She makes us spend time watching her do it. A conventional editing style could establish the beginning of the task, cut away, and return when it is complete. Ackerman refuses that efficiency. The viewer remains with the action. This means that the time of the spectator begins to resemble the time of the labor being performed. We experience the repetition. We experience the wait. We experience the waiting. We experience the lack of dramatic progression. And this is where form becomes political. The scene does not merely represent domestic labor. Its form makes us confront the labor's duration. Hollinger's discussion of feminist counter cinema is useful here because she explains that feminist filmmaking can challenge patriarchal conventions not only through different stories but through different approaches to film language and representation. The camera is equally important. Ackerman frequently holds the camera in a fixed position while Jian moves within the frame. The camera does not constantly follow her. It does not turn her movements into dramatic spectacle, and it does not repeatedly isolate her face in close-up. Instead, we see Jian as a body occupying a physical space and performing a task. This changes the relationship between the viewer and the woman on screen. Hollinger explains that feminist theories such as Claire Johnston argued that conventional cinema constructs women as signs within the systems of patriarchal meaning. Ackerman's strategy is different. She does not reduce Jian to a symbol of femininity. She gives her a material existence. We see her hands working. We see her body moving. We see the space around her. The woman's body is connected to a labor rather than simply to appearance. Repetition is another essential feature of the sequence. Jian's actions are not extraordinary. They are routine. And because the film makes us watch the routine, we begin to understand that the labor is not an isolated event. It is part of a structure that represents itself. The meal has to be prepared. The apartment has to be maintained. The household has to continue functioning. The work, therefore, renews itself. This is significant because the film's repetition mirrors the repetitive structure of domestic responsibility. Ackerman turns what could be perceived as nothing happening into the very thing we are being asked to analyze. The ordinary becomes meaningful because the film refuses to treat it as disposable. These formal choices are what allows us to understand the scene as feminist counter-cinema. Hollinger explains that Claire Johnston called for a feminist cinema that could challenge the conventional structures through which mainstream cinema represents women. Ackerman's film does exactly this, although it does so without giving the viewer a conventional feminist message. Instead, she challenges the assumptions built into the cinematic form. She changes the pace. She changes what receives attention. She changes what counts as action. And she changes our relationship to the female body. The result is not simply a more positive image of a woman. It is a different way of representing a woman's experience. This also changes our experience as spectators. At first, the scene may seem boring. We might expect something to happen. We might expect a cut. We might expect the story to move forward. But Ackerman makes us wait. That discomfort is productive. It forces us to question our own expectations about what deserves our attention. We are accustomed to a cinema that gives extended attention to action, romance, violence, and spectacle. Ackerman gives that attention to preparing food. So that scene is not only about Jian, it is also about us. It asks us to examine the values we bring to cinema as spectators. What kinds of actions do we automatically consider meaningful? What kinds of labor do we assume can remain invisible, and why? The veal cutlet sequence demonstrates how feminist film theory can analyze not only what a film represents, but how its formal choices produce meaning. Hollinger's distinction between critique and counter cinema is particularly useful here. Ackerman does not simply criticize traditional representations of women. She offers an alternative way of representing female experience. Through static framing, she avoids turning Jian into a spectacle. Through extended duration, she makes domestic labor visible. Through repetition, she reveals the ongoing structure of that labor. And by giving these activities so much cinematic attention, she challenges the assumption that ordinary women's work is significant. And the scene therefore turns a seemingly mundane activity into a political question. What happens when cinema stops looking for extraordinary stories about women and starts paying attention to the ordinary experiences that structure their lives? In Jian Tielman, the answer is that the ordinary becomes visible. And once it becomes visible, it becomes possible to question why it was invisible in the first place.